And now it's my great pleasure to ask Brian Iselin, the founder of the Geneva-based non-profit organization Slave Free Trade, to speak also about his own personal experience and especially, I think, about the supply chain. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Let me start by saying that everything Olivia and Kevin have said is absolutely true. Spot on. I fully support their observations. I've been asked to talk about supply chains, but in fact, I'd like to use my time to take you on a slightly different journey. We'll end up in supply chains, as we always do, but a brisk walk on the road, less traveled, perhaps. Maybe the less popular view, too, to be frank, but perhaps a different view, a different way to think about the Palermo Protocol 20 years on. So I've been working on human trafficking since the day 2 decades ago when I opened a sports bag and found 2 baby girls in it, one dead. They were being trafficked for adoption. And almost every day since, I've been reminded of and distressed by globally poor results, lack of improvement, a universal lack of genuine outcomes, the things that Kevin and Olivia have mentioned. I've been working with law enforcement and intelligence agencies on the problem of human trafficking in almost 50 countries since the turn of the millennium. Every time, every new location is Groundhog Day. It's the same questions, the same problems, the same barriers, and the same lack of results. Now, given the Groundhog Day analogy, it won't surprise anyone to hear me say that, frankly, when I started in this field 20 years ago, things were actually not very different. And although in just a few ways, also actually very different. At the turn of the millennium, when Palermo was newly inked, there was far less money, in fact almost none, for countering human trafficking. There was far less media attention, again, almost none. The anti-trafficking community, so to speak, was hugely fewer people than it is now, and there were vastly fewer actual organizations specializing in it, and now there are thousands and thousands. Palermo, at the turn of the millennium, was new. Everyone wanted to give this beast a run for its money. It was shiny. Palermo was in fact quite mesmerizing, and with almost a record entry into force. It started all rather well, actually. So at that time, there was a very strong focus on seeing what this little machine could do. There was hope in the community. But there was a catch. There was actually precious little in the way of analysis of what a focus on what was actually in the protocol might mean. Was the focus on what's in the protocol wise? What would be left undone but when we're looking into the protocol? And what could be done about what's being left undone? And that, in a nutshell, was our very own undoing. Fast forward to 2021, and a global billion-dollar industry has grown around the protocol and human trafficking. Rescues, awareness raising, foundations and funds, multi-stakeholder initiatives, training and education, victim support, and rehabilitation. Where there were early responses to human trafficking after Palermo, noting that at the turn of the millennium they were few and far between any actions at all, there was even then a preponderance of focus on law enforcement or criminal justice responses. When we actually started very quickly, very quickly seeing around the world was less a response to human trafficking as a phenomenon, and not everybody will agree with me here, but quite simply a response to the Palermo Protocol. Palermo was the magnet and everyone was metal. We were drawn to it. So globally, our responses to human trafficking very, very quickly, arguably within a year or two, became less problem-oriented, less looking at exploitation, and more, let's say, Palermo-flavored. For example, Australia's very first response to Palermo in 2004 was more than 95% law enforcement. It was 100% focused on sexual exploitation. It was 100% supply-side measures. There was no human rights mentioned, and likewise, no education money. And 20 years on, although the budgets have got larger, that's largely the state of the world today. The budgets have bloated hundreds and even thousands of times since then. Awareness-raising campaigns, public service announcements, poster campaigns, celebrity ambassadors even. The industry is really swinging, let's say. But we've got to ask ourselves to what end. Perhaps one big difference between now and then is that both Hollywood and philanthro-capitalists have jumped into the scene. Cashed up funds, Liam Neeson movies. Unfortunately, they're just bloating and distorting. The arrival of money is always welcome, don't get me wrong. But without regard to effectiveness, we may as well be back where we were 20 years ago with no money in our wallet. One of the biggest changes I've seen over those 20 years is the shift in language away from Palermo. In 2001, it was considered confusing to talk about slavery and servitude in the old way. The talk of the town was human trafficking, and it was, at the time of its coming out, massively overshadowed by a focus on people smuggling. The OECD member states, particularly Australia, for example, were up in arms about people smuggling. It was all people smuggling. So Palermo did successfully put the term human trafficking on the agenda. It took some years to build up a head of steam, but within 10 years, even the Bali process had become about human trafficking. Now, we can debate forever whether introducing the language of human trafficking was needed or useful. It is what it is. It came out. I would explain the language shift since then to broaden it out, bringing in terms like modern slavery as an attempt to view the same base issues of systematic exploitation of someone's labor, what we all think we understand when we talk about human trafficking, just through a wider lens, a lens wider than Palermo. From day one in the field investigating human trafficking, you realize how desperately narrow it is and hard to enforce. It was not long after we all started talking about what is human trafficking, and this is only 20 years ago we were using these sorts of phrases in police training, that we all started to see how complicated it was to see in the real world. The sheer number of ways in which the phrase, the concept, let us down in an operational sense, perhaps paved the way towards this broadening out. And to be frank, I'm completely supportive of the broadening out. Trying to introduce at that time what was considered a completely new term into so many countries and cultural contexts all at once, give it not just legal shape, but a character that could be distinguished from other conditions in the real world, is a difficult and arguably Sisyphean task. In the very same workplace, there can be victims of child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, and slavery and servitude right alongside each other. In fact, one victim can also be a victim to all of those at once. In everyday terms, the distinction between someone trafficked for forced labor and someone in forced labor who was not trafficked is completely abstract when you think about it, and very much only matters in the eyes of the beholder. The distinctions between murder, manslaughter, and culpable driving are a bit academic for the one that's lying in the morgue. So this is where we started seeing the more umbrella, modern slavery come into more common usage, at least outside the US. And to be frank, I think we have the UK, and Kevin in particular, to thank for that. It might just be that if we took an historical lens to it, the Palermo Protocol was actually hamstrung before drafting even started. Most of you would be aware of the history of the drafting of the protocol, the venomous split between the pro-prostitution and abolitionist lobbies, sliced clean through the ability of poor old Palermo to live a full and rewarding life. If drafting started in tumult, these two lobby groups not talking to each other, it ended in complete rancor. So right from that moment, whatever we expected of poor Palermo was probably going to be over-expecting. Palermo's the kind of forlorn child torn between parents, never able to please everyone at the same time. Law enforcement treaty, not human rights treaty. Punitive focus, not protection focus. Supply reduction focus, not demand reduction focus. Sexual exploitation focus, not all forms of exploitation focus. And so after working on this for so long and finding close to zero comfort in the results we were seeing, I decided it was time to have a good hard look at what we were doing and why, and what we could do better. So I started from a blank page. Nothing short of revisiting our initial assumptions will save us from perpetuating flawed responses. And taking Thoreau's advice, the best way to correct the mistake is to make it right? The very first point to note is that nobody had bothered to learn the lessons from the illicit drug experience, or indeed of pretty much any other illicit market we ever encountered. Before I started working on human trafficking, before I opened that sports bag, I was a counter-narcotics specialist working in China, Mongolia, and North Korea. We did not take the lessons from other illicit market experiences. And the very first thing the world forgot when Palermo came out is that illicit markets are driven much more by demand than by supply. And it makes the world of difference. In public policy terms, acknowledging trafficking as a response to demand changes the way we understand cause. It changes the cause. Poverty and other circumstances constitute vulnerability factors that put individuals at risk for being trafficked. But in an illicit market, they don't constitute cause. In Nietzsche's exposition on causation, vulnerabilities are these small forces that shove a boat out into the river. They are not, however, the source of the river. So since poor Palermo, the bulk of the world's counter-trafficking measures are focused on limiting these factors in supply countries where the causal demand remains neglected. Law enforcement can help reduce demand for illicit products, of course, but not if it's being directed to exclusively focus on supply-side activity. So why are we so fixated on supply, and how did that end up screwing us up on cause? The simplest explanation is actually logical error. There's a common flaw in logic. It's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy that defines the bulk of the world's responses to human trafficking. The almost exclusively supply-side focus is post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because most people are poor before being trafficked, does not make poverty the cause. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of people in poverty are not trafficked. It is not a cause. The same applies to other vulnerability factors. These are often called push factors, such as domestic violence, being in prostitution, lack of citizenship, age, proximity to crime clusters, ethnicity, etc. I'm not implying by any of this to say that supply-side measures are a waste. I have a law enforcement background. I'm completely criminal justice background. So I strongly believe in supply-side measures. They're not a waste, but as we can also see in all the other illicit markets, supply-side measures alone cannot solve trafficking because the market will remain regardless of what we do with supply. Sources of supply, humans in this case, are so plentiful, cheap, and so little restricted to any one country or region, it's impossible to affect an illicit market sufficiently by tackling only the supply end. Supply-side measures in illicit markets can limit push factors, but they serve more to displace traffic. When law enforcement operations displace a criminal organization, it's a displacement of the traffic. It's not changing the market dynamics. It's not changing the dimensions of the market, and it's not creating fundamental change in the global problem. The reasons for the post-Palermo fixation on the supply side of trafficking are they're pretty numerous and quite complex. But this post hoc ergo propter hoc, seeing trafficking as determined by sequence, that poverty and other vulnerability is followed by recruitment of trafficking, is one reason. That's a reason for our fixation on the supply side. Poor Palermo was also not even allowed to go down the demand path. It was kept squarely in the supply side lane during the drafting wars between pro-prostitution and abolition, and it stayed there. Very little reference to demand. Demand is almost, as you read it, it's like, and don't forget demand. Importantly also, demand countries, let's say OECD, prefer not to criticize their own laws and institutions. Political reality is such that the most powerful governments need the international community to accept their prevailing understanding of what trafficking is and what drives it, because it both excuses the failure of national and international efforts against trafficking, and yet, at the same time, it's tricky, it justifies their expansion. This is a very old, let's say even Roman, strategic planning play. It's called the more troops gambit. This is where bureaucrats that run responses to threats, like human trafficking, for example, and politicians, of course, they first engineer a switch to a war rhetoric. You've all seen this, the tough talk. War on trafficking, combat trafficking, crackdown, it's all very tough language, right? Then they declare that the lack of troops has created the failure to respond to this, and more troops will define success. And remember that bureaucracies exist to self-perpetuate. So most governments seek responses that can be implemented in a 3-year term, transmitted in a 20-second soundbite, and the impact of which will never be measured. So declaring a war on trafficking will never lose someone an election. And if it fails to secure results, more troops gambit. It needs more troops. So many countries have fallen into a rather, let's say, circular trap because of Palermo. Maybe not because of Palermo, but certainly especially since Palermo. When tackling trafficking, we tend towards punitive approaches because of our reliance on law enforcement. Let's face it, the Palermo Protocol is a law enforcement tool. As the leading tool that was developed to tackle human trafficking, though, the Palermo Protocol then became the golden hammer. When all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And it's so too with trafficking. If the leading international instrument you have for defining and addressing the concept is a law enforcement treaty, not a human rights treaty, not a migration treaty, it's a law enforcement tool, everything starts to look like a law enforcement problem. In relying on law enforcement responses, we fail to take account of the shortcomings. As I say, I'm a law enforcement background. I died in the wool law enforcement, but all the talk about intelligence-led policing, most law enforcement is about mopping up spilt milk. Experience from tackling other illicit markets demonstrates that law enforcement alone is a manifestly unsuccessful model for reducing or eliminating an illicit market. It's got to be there, but it will never do it on its own. There are not now and never will be enough police resources to pursue enough trafficking cases to make a difference. To think otherwise is just simply based on a misunderstanding of what law enforcement can achieve on a crime like this. The single most compelling reason, though, that law enforcement should not be the leading tool against human trafficking and comes from one simple figure, 0.01%. This is the percentage of global estimated cases for trafficking, forced labor, child labor, etc., that might be considered resolved. It's a dreadful number, despite the billions that we're now spending on it. When your golden hammer is a law enforcement treaty, law enforcement is what you do. So let's start thinking beyond Palermo, is my point. The very shortcomings and unsatisfactory outcomes of Palermo, of the Palermo world, caused me to set up a demand-side organization, a behavioral one called Slave-Free Trade. You can see it on the wall behind me. So at Slave-Free Trade, what we're trying to do is shake everything up, actually. We revisit what success would look like, and then we build behavioral positivist solutions to achieve that. Going into the Palermo Protocol drafting, what was on the table was a tool to rid the world of exploitation of the labor of other people. What we ended up with was not that. For me, success against human trafficking is really, really simple. A reduction in the number of workplaces in the world where people are exploited. I don't know whether you've seen the Eastwood movie, The Unforgiven. His character in that, William Money, unambiguously revealed the heart of demand-side measures when he said, you can't buy flesh. So success to me, and what was there before the protocol, before Palermo was drafted, looks like a market characterized by goods and services where flesh has indeed not been bought but freely hired. A market in which only free labor has gone into the products. Success for me is something poor Palermo can never give us. That's a world free from exploitation. Only we can do that, and that starts with identifying our own role in it. I preached a lot, Michel. I'm sorry, but I just...
No, you preach well. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Actually, thank you for sharing your field experience and work through your human rights intelligence platform. And actually, I think it's very good that you are pointing the finger at supply chains, and that way everyone, including consumers, could play a role in preventing and combating human trafficking.
I have here a question from Imelda Poole, who is asking, if you were launching a new anti-modern slavery alliance today, representing all disciplines working against human trafficking, what would be your first objective? There's a second question. How would you implement positive behavioral solutions with the troops gathered? Thank you. So what would be your first step? And then how would you implement positive behavioral solutions? Who would like to suggest a first step? Please.
Well, in fact, I mean, that's what I did 4 years ago when I started Slave Free Trade, right? The idea was, let's start rethinking all of these things. Let's see what would work on modern slavery. How can we reduce exploitation of people for the things that we're working on? There are a lot of people at the not at the table, I should say, on modern slavery that really can play a role. So let me give you a very good example. I'd come back from missions completely exhausted, emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted, have deep conversations with a lot of people needing to vent, right? And those people would be wringing their hands. Some of them were even put off their meals. But the next day, they'd be back at H&M, or they'd be back at Zara buying the same clothes that they were buying the day before. And a part of the problem we have is that we are not communicating to people in a way that they can genuinely take action in a timely way based on the information we give them. So you see a press release that says there's 152 million, UNICEF says there's 152 million children in child labor. People will wring their hands when they read that, but there's nothing they feel they can do about it. There's this thing called cognitive dissonance, which sets in 7 seconds after such a pronouncement if there's no immediate action that can be taken. So 152 million children in child labor, that's a terrible thing. No action can be taken. It goes to the back of the brain because we can't function as humans if we keep that at the front of the brain. The dissonance is a protective mechanism. So that all changes completely if you give every individual or an individual an action they can take, a small, cheap, easy action they can take within seconds of seeing the information. So this is where I talk about behavioral responses. This is what one of the things Slave Free Trade is doing. So, a sign on an investment on the New York Stock Exchange to say that's a human rights compliant company. Investors interested in human rights compliant companies, not interested in spending on exploitation, know within seconds that that's a company that they can invest in safely. Same for a chocolate bar on the shelves that is slave free. The consumer can see immediately this is a slave free product. Admittedly, you can't trust what's out there at the moment, but very, very soon you will be able to see in an app, you'll be able to see that chocolate bar actually is guaranteed human rights compliant through the supply chain, and then you can buy it. So it's really important if you're going to talk about behavioral responses, to identify which audiences can play a role: ethical consumer, ethical investor, public procurement agency, and then you deliver to them the decision intelligence they need to change their buying decision. And every single one of those very small micro actions, the consumer choosing that chocolate bar, the investor on the New York Stock Exchange choosing that company over that company, the public procurement agency choosing this bid over those other 4 bids because it's human rights compliant, because they take this micro decision based on accurate decision intelligence, that's a small clap multiplied by millions. This is how we're going to achieve social change. And it's the only way we're going to achieve social change on the kind of scale we need to tackle the problem of 152 million children in child labor.
If I just come in there now, I totally agree with Brian, and I really think that he's example of giving people something to do. And that's really why the climate change was so effective, because there were things brought in that we could all do. Use a recycled cup when we go for a cup of coffee, not take plastic bags when you go shopping. And, now you'd be frowned on if you took bags from a supermarket. We did change cultural behavior because we get positive things that people could do. And then obviously there is the requirement of businesses now, to change, and there's going to be big investment. And obviously there's a global conference, the COP26, which is all focusing on climate. And there's going to be billions thrown into that. I mean, absolutely billions thrown into that. And I think the one thing that we need to be realistic about as well is, what is it you're asking, as Brian said, what is it you're asking people to do? What is it that people can do in their community or in their everyday life to make a difference? And we need to be able to make sure they're getting that information, because at the moment it will be, something that is beyond their either ability, interest, or where they would normally behave. You can't say to everybody, phone the police, phone this, phone that, every time you see something, because it's everywhere, because people just get exhausted by it. Whereas if you can give them something that they can focus on in their local community, and it has to be information, as Brian says, that's actually evidence-based, that's real in that environment, that people just don't, after hearing it, go, well, that can't be the case. And even when we hear about these big cases, like in the UK, of big cases of, big organisations involved in trafficking, like we saw in Leicester, it didn't affect one bit their trade. In fact, it acted as a good advertising because their sales went up, or their shares went up by 40%, and everybody thought that they would go down. So what is it that those people could be informed about? And a lot of it would be about getting the standards in that local community improved, making sure that those workers are being looked after, making sure you're calling out where the tax breaches are, and the fact that there's bad conditions around fire conditions and prevention of this. It's like, there are all other ways to do it. And I think working that out is important. So if you're talking about an alliance, first of all, an alliance could be too big if you're trying to encompass everything, particularly, say, in the context of, say, the UK, where there are hundreds of organisations involved in this. Look at what your expertise are. Look at where your experience is, where your credibility is, and then start to develop that. But if you get, as I often say, my father was in construction, and he always said, when I talked to him about human trafficking, he said, you're trying to build a house sometimes the way that I see it, and he'd look at it in a different way. He said, it seems to me sometimes people are trying to build a house without putting the foundations down. You're building a house on sand. So you get so far up and it collapses. He said, and even if you start getting the house built, you've got the plumber coming in and do the electrical work. And then when somebody comes along and inspects it, it doesn't get a certification. That's kind of an analogy. We need to have the people, the experts doing what they need to do, all in the right place, doing the right things, getting communities and people involved with what they can achieve, and coming up with some innovative ideas that are meaningful and not just doing more of the same. When are we going to say that some of the things we've been doing for a long time just haven't worked? I do agree with a lot of what Brian says. I think there is a role for prosecution, but I completely agree that there's a bigger role for stopping this in the first place. As a police officer, prevention was far better than prosecution, and we prevented things over the years. I can, give you ideas about, when I first joined the police, car theft was enormous. Now it's really hard to steal a car, so cars aren't getting stolen. But that was because of the change of the design of cars and the security and the manufacture. It wasn't because the police got better. So there's a good example. We need much wider thinking about prevention and what that really means and how we engage people in a meaningful way.
Up, Brian, please, and then we'll have Dr. Smith.
Leave the microphone off. I wanted to just add to what Kevin was saying. There was one very interesting thing is that in the non-profit world, so this, if you talk about a human trafficking alliance, I guess you're talking about starting a non-profit. One of the things to remember there is the non-profit world is no different from the business world. Startups die at record rates. So if you want to start something completely from scratch and do something completely new, there's a huge risk there. It's the startup grind you've got to go through. I would argue that one of the better things to do is get involved in something that exists and try to expand it, grow it, develop it in the directions where your expertise makes sense. And I would also add that one of the things that we need, if we're talking about a problem of the size we're talking, Kevin's alluded a couple of times to the success of the E in ESG, the Environmental Climate Change Lobby. One of their successes is that they've been able to generate movement development, movement building, as opposed to small actions by small actors, and multiplied by, many small actors. What we have, there's a great saying about this. We don't need to solve this. We don't need 100 people doing everything perfectly. We need 1 million people doing everything imperfectly. So the movement building is something that we really need to be focusing much more on. So I would argue if you want to do some sort of a human trafficking alliance, look at some movement building work you could be doing. That's a great place to get involved.